You are listening to the serialized audiobook podcast for Blood of the Stars, an epic fantasy novel written by Karyne Norton, read by Paeter Frandsen and Karyne Norton. If you can't wait to listen to the whole audiobook, or if you want a signed physical copy, go to karynnorton.com/shop to get the lowest cost by buying direct. You can also find the audiobook on Audible, Barnes & Noble, and other standard retailers. Please enjoy the next installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton.
Chapter 21. Karyne watched Aura perch on the prow of the boat, eyes closed as she played with the blonde braid she wore as a bracelet. Her own dark hair fluttered around her cheeks, the short strands caught by the wind. Even her skin seemed a shade darker, as if being on the water brought renewed health. There was an unnatural quality to the way she stood, leaning forward as if she might dive over the edge at any moment, and yet her balance never faltered as her skirt tangled around her legs. He was surprised Lenda hadn't given her a nicer gown to wear, more so Lenda wouldn't have to bear the out-of-date peasant look. But maybe Lenda was too preoccupied. Sometime during the night, she'd given in to her seasickness, refusing to leave her quarters and not letting anyone except her maid, not even Aura, by her side. It was a relief for Karyne to not have to address their bond, but without Lenda, Aura's strangeness became more apparent, leaving the men more unsettled. They eyed her warily as they worked, whispering amongst themselves. Karyne stepped to the middle of the quarterdeck until the main mast blocked his view of her trance-like state. Perhaps he was as superstitious as the men, but pretending she wasn't on board made his shoulders loosen and his stance relax.
"Will she come back with us from Bamboo Island?"
Larkos asked, his hand on the wheel of the ship. Doubtful. Karyne glanced at his first mate, whose curiosity was only apparent in the slight narrowing of his eyes. "Depends on what happens when we reach it. I expect she'll part ways with us there." Karyne ran his thumb over the daisy on his dagger, relishing its solid weight and reminder of his goal.
"You have no idea what you're doing,"
Larkos laughed, the star-shaped tattoos near his eyes crinkled in a dance.
"How long has she had you doing her bidding? Was this entire voyage her idea and she roped you into offering your boat?"
"I only met her 2 nights ago." The moment the words were out of Karyne's mouth, he regretted the admission. Larkos' eyebrows nearly reached his hairline.
2 nights ago? Then she must have bewitched you into bringing her."
Karyne shrugged off the accusation. Any excuse he gave would only confirm such a theory. Besides, he wasn't entirely sure that she hadn't used magic to persuade him. He still questioned the sanity of bringing her on board. "There's something I lost," he finally said. "She knows how to find it. If I hadn't brought her, she would have hunted it down for herself. She might have beaten me to it."
"Nothing's faster than star speed,"
Larkos scoffed, his grip on the wheel tightening. Karyne's mind tuned in to his own memories, honing in on the way Aura had looked dead, hunched over his desk, the way life had suddenly infused her. He was no longer sure of anything, least of all Starspeed's ability to beat a woman with mysterious magic to Bamboo Island. He didn't want to answer any more of Larkos' prying questions. In fact, he needed to get his own questions answered. As he made his way across the deck and back up to the bow of the ship where Aura still balanced, he debated if he would lose face by speaking to the woman on the ship or gain ground by showing a lack of fear. Either way, it was too late. The men had all watched his approach, and backing down now would make him look like a fool. "Are you able to sleep standing?" he asked. She smiled softly, opening her eyes. "Who could sleep with the sun's light on them?" Karyne paused, squinting toward the rising sun. Perhaps she was still weak, but he didn't think so. She must be as devout as their priest for a phrase like that to leave her lips without a hint of a mocking tone. When we reach the island, what will you do? His heart beat faster at the question, unsure what he hoped her answer would be. If she wanted to use the Star Bridge, he would be willing to give it up for Daisy. But what if she was also looking for the girl? She leaned forward, eyes on the water where it parted for star speed to cut through. I can sense things better on land. He waited for a real answer, but she kept her eyes on the foam, oblivious to his impatience. Will you use it if we find it? She stiffened, then pulled herself away from the boat's edge to face him. Use what? He hesitated, wondering again if they really were looking for the same thing. She'd said it was a star bridge, maybe something more. Aren't you wanting to cross the barrier? A short laugh escaped her lips. No. She turned back to lean over the water, frowning. It seems the barriers have only served to make men more curious, more desperate. Her words came out mumbled, like she was no longer aware of his presence. It felt like a dismissal, but he hadn't learned anything about her magic or her true motives. If he'd been able to touch her, he could use his weaker second spoke to determine if she told the truth, but she'd already warned him against that. Besides, the last time he'd tried, she'd been a blank wall. He reached out, tuning in to her memories for some hint, but it was still like none existed. He frowned, unsure how she was blocking his intrusion so completely. Usually, when he met resistance, flashes of images still broke through. How did you know my name the night we met? She watched the water long enough that he thought he wouldn't get an answer. When she finally spoke, her words came out slow and measured. Everyone knows the Prince of L&S. He made a face at the title. Those who knew him well knew not to use it. But I started paying attention when I heard you wanted the book The Sins of the Stars. Her eyes found his, burning into him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. When her gaze shifted to his coat pocket, he knew she'd seen him studying it between tasks, poring over it for any detail he might have missed. He'd put out requests for that book several moons ago. Did that mean she'd been watching him that long? Why? She sat precariously on the boat's edge, a single rogue wave away from being thrown to the sea. Against his better judgment, he felt no fear for her safety. Somehow, Karyne suspected she was immune to such a simple end. The handwritten notes inside are peculiar, right? She asked. He stilled, thinking of how he'd first found her camped out in his swamp hideout. It bothered him that she'd been following him so closely, even going through his things, but his need for answers overrode that. What did she make of the strange symbols marked with references to various people groups and locations? Were they places the star bridges were hidden? Places they were last seen? The people who'd been given charge of them? Those were the questions he wanted to ask, but they felt too vulnerable. How did you see them? She shook her head slightly. I wrote them. His mouth swung open before he could stop himself, and he clamped it shut before any of his men could see. He glanced around, making sure none were within hearing range while closing the distance between him and Aura. Have you already found some of the objects? Her lids lowered, and she ducked her head. They've slipped through my fingers over the years. His knees felt weak, even as his heart rate picked up its pace. He crouched beside her. Which ones? When? Where did you last see them? When we reach the island, what will you do? She turned his own question on him. Will you use it? She spat the word out. If we find it? He hesitated, unsure which answer she wanted to hear. It was only fair that she wanted to know his motives just like he wanted to know hers, but one of them had to show their hand first. He didn't want it to be him. Besides, he didn't know. He'd wanted to find the Starbridges to find Daisy. Now that she was accessible without the Starbridges, the drive to find them had weakened. Aura studied him while the spray of the salt water misted against their arms. When he didn't answer, she let out a stilted laugh. Two types of men seek the Starbridges. One who wishes to make the world bigger, to fill it with all sorts of wonder created by people far and wide, and one who wishes to make the world smaller, to fit it in the palm of his hand and hold it in his fist. She closed her eyes, her lashes suspiciously wet. Which one are you? The answer seemed obvious, but her vulnerability made him truly ask himself the question. Why did he want the Starbridges? His hand slipped to his dagger once more, the hard lines of the grip swirling to the pommel, where the ridges of the daisy gave him focus. This had all started as a way to find out what had happened to Daisy. A small part of him wondered if the Starbridges could still be useful for protection. He didn't know why Emerus had sent Daisy away. Maybe he'd need to use a Starbridge to take her back to Lorvandus to continue protecting her. Beyond that, the adventurous side of him relished the idea of exploration. Finding the Starbridges could unite the people, not just in Vendaris, but all of Riston. He thought that would make the world bigger, breaking down the barriers and bringing people together again. It would be a far better way for him to spend his time as Throne Warden than sitting in a stuffy palace. But what if the people across the barriers didn't want unification? What if war broke out the same way it had before the barriers had been put in place? Whether he wanted to or not, it was possible he could eventually use the Starbridges for control, to make the world the place he thought it should be, even if others disagreed. The idea left him nauseous, like Lenda's seasickness had suddenly become contagious. Deep down, he knew Larkos was right. Garen had been raised to see progenies as better, more valuable than half-lights who couldn't do magic. He tried to work with his men and see them as equals, but even his authority as captain made it impossible to truly see them that way. It made it impossible for them to see him as anything other than someone who controlled them. Aura waited for an answer, but the time he spent working it out seemed to already be answer enough. She turned away, her face impassive. I want to be the first man, the one who makes the world bigger, he said, letting the words hang in the air as an unfinished sentence. But I don't know if I am, but I'm probably the second, were both viable endings. Did that mean he should give up the search? Was she saying he wasn't noble enough to use the Starbridges? Perhaps you will be. Her lips twitched like she had a secret. She was a mystery and clearly wanted to remain one, but she didn't feel like a danger. Yet. Still, he wanted to know more about her notes in his book. He opened his mouth to ask again, but her gaze shifted over his shoulder, her smile deepening with amusement. Your bondmate has graced the deck with her beauty. You should go see her before her jealous rage mixes with her sensitive stomach. He turned to find Lenda glaring at them from the doorway of her quarters, arms wrapped around her stomach like she held its contents at bay. The men all paused in their work, gazes volleying between Garen and Lenda like they expected an entertaining showdown. Guilt swarmed through Garen's chest, and he stepped away from Aura before he could evaluate why. He hadn't done anything wrong. Why should he feel guilt just because Lenda misread the moment? He ran his thumb over his palm, tracing the bond mark with his nail as if he might be able to dig it out. He should apologize and tell Lenda about the Starbridge, give her peace of mind that she was the only woman he was interested in. His feet propelled him forward, but halfway across the deck, he realized it was the bond urging him to do and feel those things, so he jerked to a stop. With a bow small enough to possibly be a snub, he acknowledged Lenda's presence above deck, then made his way to the quarterdeck, where Larkos' shoulders shook with held-back laughter.
It's like you want to have a miserable marriage,
the older man said. Karyne took the wheel, knowing the need to display his authority was as childish and privileged as Larkos had accused him of being.
Linda's suspicion is only a quarter of your problem, though,
Larkos warned. He leaned back against the bulkhead and retied his sleek black hair in a knot at his neck, drawing Karyne's attention to his Wheel of Magic tattoo once more. Something about the tattoo bothered Karyne, and he couldn't put his finger on what.
I can only do so much to keep the men supporting you.
Larkos crossed his arms and frowned.
Aura draws the men in while simultaneously repelling them. They think you've brought a witch on board.
At least Larkos wasn't bringing up Riverin. Maybe no one cared about the traitorous X with the threat of a witch. The hidden progenies, witches to most, were driven mad by their aspirations for more magic. They worshipped the stars' power more than the sun's light, and their blood magic and sacrificial practices were barbaric, murderous acts that Karyne hoped Enla would abolish once all the threats of war had passed. The witch's obsession matched Mavis's, and for a moment he wondered if the power-hungry priestess could be from the witch's coven, secretly rising to power. It would fit the strangeness about her that he couldn't quite explain. Something about Aura seemed different, though. Maybe her motivation or the way she held back her power instead of displaying it for the world to see. But maybe false humility was part of her strategy. Perhaps I have brought a witch, Karyne murmured. Larkos' gaze snapped to him.
Don't let the men hear you say that.
Then he laughed.
Or Linda.
Chapter 22. The tunnel the Vendarans took Aeliana and Cyrus through was more like the scratched-out remains of a mole's burrow. At various points, the paths veered off into dead ends, as if the person digging out the tunnel hadn't been able to decide which direction was best. When it sloped downward, the mud often gave way to water, but when it angled back up, the ceiling didn't necessarily adjust, forcing the entire party to bend at the waist until the ground gave way again. Aeliana couldn't fathom their position beneath the sea. Supposedly, most of the tunnels had been formed by lava tubes thousands of years before, and progenies had used magic to break through the rest of the hard earth while stabilizing and connecting them. Veldin had given that explanation as if it might comfort the newcomers, but it only made Aeliana more uneasy. In addition to picturing the tunnels collapsing beneath the weight of the water above, she imagined fresh lava at their backs. She forced herself to relax, to think of the open air on the other side. They were almost through the 12-mile trek that would bring them out from the caves to the main land around the time of the sun's sleep. But after she had traveled across the barrier by using a star bridge, spent a restless day debating if she made the right choice, then attacked her guardians on a dragon, she was ready to fall asleep on her feet. Even the Vendarans seemed unsettled, but Aeliana suspected that was related to the lack of light. She sensed her own blood craving replenishment, but found it more like the ache of hunger versus the nausea of satiety, far more manageable. For the most part, the shuffle of boots against rock was only joined by the drip, drip, drip of water. She shivered in the dank air. "Would you like an extra cloak?" Lukai asked. Aeliana shook her head, then glanced in Cyrus's direction. He spoke animatedly with Kendallin, whose face remained bunched up in irritation. The other woman had yet to smile, at least when Eliana was around. Maybe Eliana should engage Lukai more, ask questions about her homeland, discover more about this man who was her bondmate. But her eyes fought to stay open, and placing one foot in front of the other for the remainder of the day was all she could manage. By the time they reached the surface, and Silmar instructed them to make camp, every muscle in Eliana's body demanded that she sit or lie down, but she refused to be seen as a weak link. She dropped her quiver and bow to the earth, still ridden with bamboo shoots, and assisted Holm in laying out the bedrolls in the small clearing they'd found amongst the thick trees. Their variety was unfamiliar to Eliana. Large leaves and larger trunks that soaked up the perpetual wetness of the rainforest. Lukai and Jasperus used the tree's limbs to replace the foliage hiding the lava tube entrance, their easy banter drifting across camp. Holm rose from the last bedroll and leaned back slightly, as if that particular stance was the only way to balance the large gut before him. "You should rest," he offered, gesturing to the bedrolls they'd just laid out. Despite his girth, there was a formidable thickness to his limbs that should have left her on edge. Instead, his quiet manner made him more approachable than Jasperus, whose theatrical voice still startled her when it came from his small frame. "I'm not sure I'd be able to get back up for the evening meal." Her gaze shifted to the nearby fire that Kendallin had built and stoked. The other woman flitted around the flames, her tiny frame almost childlike, but there was a beauty in the way the glow shone over her light brown skin, the way her black hair had been braided across her crown. It made Eliana reconsider Iris's offer to cut off her locks. As Kendallin leaned forward, a leather cord slipped from beneath her tunic, and a small object flashed in the firelight. Kendallin's eyes swung in Eliana's direction, as if she sensed her curiosity, but a vicious frown crossed her face, and she turned her back on Eliana. "Don't let her get to you," Holm said. "Had a rough upbringing and doesn't trust easily. Eventually, she'll crack. She's all soft inside." Eliana smiled faintly as Iris joined them. "Who's all soft inside? You'd better not be spilling my secrets." The older woman poked Holm in the gut, then pecked his cheek when he doubled over. During lunch, Eliana had spotted their bond marks and had watched them ever since. If this was how things could someday be with Lukai, perhaps the bond wasn't such a terrible thing. "He was talking about Kendallin," Eliana said. "Ah, give it some time." Iris's wrinkles smoothed out as her gaze softened. "I was a bit like her when I was young. Took a lot of time healing from old wounds." "I might have helped things along," Holm said. She swatted him, then turned back to Eliana. "You'll have to earn her respect, love. Your starlock helps." The word stirred up anxiety and fueled her curiosity. "How does it work?" "It's a bit like oil in a lantern," Holmes said, still rubbing his side with one hand while wrapping the other arm around Iris. "It keeps the fire of the magic lit, but eventually it runs out until it can recharge in the light of the sun. So it's like our blood? She tried not to let her disgust taint her willingness to understand. Holm angled his head side to side, as if weighing the accuracy of her words. In function, yes. But a starlock also strengthens the magic of your blood tenfold, maybe more. Tenfold? Eliana shuddered. This was what her guardians had been watching for. Not just for her to realize she could do magic, but for her to come into a far greater power. She stuck her hand in her pocket, testing out the tiny sharp edges of her starlock. How do the stars decide who gets a starlock, and when? Iris clucked her tongue. The stars can only do what the sun asks of them. Eliana winced, forgetting their differences in faith. But why an awakening? Why not just give them a starlock? She really wanted to ask if others saw visions and memories in their awakenings, but Iris and Holm didn't have starlocks, and Silmar had made it sound like the experience of receiving one was something to keep private. Sometimes the sun uses the awakening to test the recipient's character in the present, Holmes said. Or the sun might use an awakening to reveal aspects of one's future. Eliana squirmed, wishing she could remember more details from her visions. They'd grown more blurred in her mind, like a dream that faded the longer she was awake. Sometimes the awakening is used to call them out on their past. Holm continued. There's a purpose, even if we don't understand it. Some half-lights are chosen, but don't survive the experience. To be chosen and to survive, it's a gift. Despite the muggy air and the warmth of the nearby fire, coldness swept through Eliana's limbs. Out of habit, she searched the skies for dark spirits. It didn't feel like a gift. Still, even through Holmes' quiet explanation, Eliana sensed awe, maybe longing. She glanced at his bare neck. Can you not do magic? No. He frowned. I never developed any skills. Those who do often start training to prepare for their awakening, but it's difficult to learn much before receiving a starlock. Only 1 in 10 of us get them, or we used to. It might be more like 1 in 20 these days. Iris nodded her agreement at his estimate. Eliana raised her eyebrows in surprise. So this group is unusual? Iris laughed. Very much so. Outside of the schools, there's probably not another group with this much training or experience. Maybe with Mavis. Holmes' face puckered in irritation. Well, I didn't mention the witches either, did I? Iris pulled away from his grasp. I thought we were talking about progenies worthy of respect. Witches? Eliana asked. Progenies who use blood magic and worship the stars. Holm clarified. Iris smacked him again with a guilty look at Eliana. You're nothing like them, love. She nodded, even though it sounded exactly like the way she'd been raised. Instead of evaluating her discomfort, she redirected the subject. I thought anyone with star blood could be chosen. Most of the chosen have a higher concentration of star blood, but sometimes people have that and still don't receive a starlock. Holm shrugged. My family has never had much. My mother's parents pushed her to marry a man with a higher concentration of star blood. They thought she'd have more chance of bearing children who would get chosen. His smile was more of a grimace. That didn't work out so well. My guardians used my blood for its magic, but I never really developed any of my own. Eliana bit her lip, trying to decide if that was a good thing. Sure you did, Iris said. I saw the bed of daisies you grew. That's unusual. It hints that you might lean toward the earth elemental. Some progenies develop a second spoke, which then gives them access to the rim of the wheel of magic. The earth elemental falls on the rim between the constructive noetic and somatic spokes. I suspect those will be your strengths. Even if you only develop one spoke, you'll be surprised at what you can do now that you have your starlock. Eliana opened her mouth to protest, but the words died on her lips. The idea of using magic had always been so detestable. The concept equated with the horror of what her guardians had done. But her guardians didn't have starlocks. They'd just had her blood. Could she simply choose to use it now? Especially now that she had a starlock? She wasn't sure she wanted answers to those questions. After dinner, Lukai and Cyrus pulled her aside. Cyrus says you have a wound that needs healing, Lukai said. Cyrus gave her a sheepish grin. If you're as tired as I am, it can't feel good to also have that pack scratching your scabs. She sighed and undid her top button, turning to let her collar fall enough for Lukai to see the marks on her back. His intake of breath brought back all her fears, and she and Cyrus shared a grimace. Does Silmar know about this? She shook her head. Arvid and Vera were communicating with someone, most likely Mavis. Even as he spoke, he ran his hands over the scabs, a coolness settling into her skin that made her sigh in relief. I keep forgetting to tell him, but I will. I'll let him know, Cyrus offered. Thank you, she said as he headed for the cook fire. She wasn't sure she had the energy to deal with Silmar's response. Lukai tugged on her shoulder so she could face him. All done, he said. Thanks. She buttoned her shirt once more, and an awkward silence hung between them. The last couple days have been... Lukai fought to find the right word as he scratched the back of his neck. Strange. She laughed, a light, airy thing that made her inwardly cringe. If it's been strange for you, a Vendarin, imagine how it's been for me. He smiled, his gaze drifting over her shoulder, back at the others. A lock of his golden hair fell in his eyes, and Eliana wondered if she should brush it away. The thought was so absurd, she almost laughed. Look, he said, I don't have any expectations for the two of us. I'm your bondmate, and I will protect you, but it doesn't have to be more if you don't want it. It's not fair to expect anything else from you when you didn't choose this. He gestured between them. You didn't choose it either, she pointed out. He shrugged. I know. They stared at each other for a long moment. Let's work on being friends, for now, she said. Friends who have this strange impulse to protect each other. I think that's all I can handle until we get my blood back anyway. She wrapped her arms around herself, even though the forest air was still thick and warm. Fair enough. His smile seemed wider, lighter, a vast contrast from Silmar's dark look as he headed their way. After extensive questioning about the marks on her back, Silmar finally let them all go to sleep. Aeliana's dreams were filled with blood and tears. It could have been memories of the last 2 days all squished together. It could have been what she feared might be the result of Mavis having her blood. But when she woke in the night, she realized half the sobs she'd heard came from Cyrus. Unsure if he'd welcome comfort from someone partly responsible for Della's death, Aeliana remained curled up on her bedroll, crying silent tears along with him. The next 2 days passed in a similar fashion, only instead of trekking through lava tubes, slightly improved by progenies, they walked through forests of bamboo and giant taro, still thick and untamed. Having caught up on rest, everyone was determined to take their turn walking with Aeliana and Cyrus, comparing Lorvandan and Vendaran history and culture, if nothing else because it got them out of the duty of hacking overgrown trees in their path. Cyrus's excitement distracted him from his grief. It was like the text of the Legend of the Stars was coming to life before his eyes. Aeliana was glad he at least had that. Despite his tears during the night, he'd stepped away from the group to worship the stars, had even invited her to join him. It didn't matter that the stars hadn't stepped in to save his grandmother. He still called on them to guide him through his grief. Aeliana and Cyrus drilled Veldin and Jasperus about the landscape of Vendaris when they discovered Silmar meant for them to cross most of it. Jasperus gestured to the ferns and canopies of trees.
After we get through this rainforest, we'll spill out into the plains, which will be much faster, though more exposed travel.
The air was still thick with the scent of rain and wet soil, but the edges of the forest rippled until fields of grass stretched before them, dotted by the occasional tree or waterhole. After a moment, Jasperus dropped his hand, and the illusion disappeared. "Is that noetic magic?" Cyrus asked. "Are you tricking our minds?"
"Ah," Jasperus said, "that's a good guess, but these are more like physical masks. I adjust the elements before you to create something tangible. It's a temporary change, but still a physical one you can touch, so it's a somatic skill. Though touch often dispels the illusion. I can't hold anything for very long, because I'm pushing against its natural composition."
Cyrus begged for another illusion, and Jasperus happily complied, narrating it with a fanciful story that likely held little truth. With his misleadingly small frame and gray beard, he was like a grandfather gathering children at his knee, while his deep voice carried them across unknown mountains and waters. Veldin joined them, adding his own commentary to Jasperus's story. "Do you know where my mother lived?" Aeliana asked. "None of this feels familiar to me."
"Selenoft."
A small smile crossed Veldin's face.
"You come from the eastern regions, which is why your skin is lighter, like Lukai's and Kendallin's."
Cyrus snorted and slid back the arm of his priestly robes to reveal an even paler arm with freckles.
"Ah, your human skin doesn't absorb the sun's light the way ours does,"
Veldin said.
"It doesn't pull the warmth into the blood because you have no star blood."
"So the darker the skin, the stronger the power?" Cyrus asked.
"Not exactly, just maybe stronger ancestral ties to the stars. It's said their skin is a rich, deep brown, darker than the soil of this forest." the better to reflect the sun's glory. Cyrus frowned. What is Selenoft like? Eliana asked, eager to avoid the religious debate she sensed brewing in Cyrus's mind. It had a seaside sun-gazer, Veldin said, resting on the eastern cliffs of Vendaris, a majestic place with a sharp drop to the sea on the east and a sloping decline to the city's valley on the west. I take it Mavis destroyed it? Cyrus asked. Veldin nodded, his smile fading. Officially, she had it torn down because Emerus was in league with the witches. Not sure how Mavis got that declared. Eliana's disappointment grew. I loved being by the shore in Lorvandus, but I don't remember living by it as a child. What do you remember? Jasperus asked. It had been a long time since Eliana had thought of her life before her guardians. The question stirred up a deep longing. She should have grown up in the safety of a stargazer with her parents. Wait, no, a sun-gazer. This place should feel like home, but it didn't. Not yet. The rain picked up speed, pattering on the leaves around them. She let the rhythm of it bring in memories as fuzzy as the mist surrounding them. I remember feelings mostly. The presence of people, but blank faces. Arvid and Vera told me so many lies that they contradicted themselves. I don't know what's true, not even my memories, which are more likely a fabricated mix of truth and lies. There were some things that stood out in her memory. A sense of belonging, being held, warmth and security. A smile parting a brown beard and mustache. The sound of high laughter mixed with deep belly laughs. And daisies. So many daisies. The memories mingled together the same way the visions she'd received in her awakening had overlapped in confusing loops and layers. It all felt too personal to share, too deeply felt. Kendallin could help you separate the truth from the lies, Veldin said. Eliana shook her head. Silmar said he and Iris are the only ones who've met my mother. The vague memories I have probably can't even be confirmed by someone who knew her well. Maybe not even by her. Her throat grew tight. That's not what I meant, Veldin said. She and I are both nomadics. My skills focus more on sifting through things in the present, but she's best at sifting through things in the past. Eliana shuddered at the thought of Kendallin digging through her memories, dissecting them for bits of truth. Or not. Veldin laughed, and the fishhooks hanging from his ears shook. He still wore a mere vest over his chest, and Eliana wondered if he would don more clothing when they reached cooler regions. Iris had helped him shear his hair close to his head the night before, once again offering to trim Eliana's hair to what Iris called a respectable length. What's after the plains? Cyrus asked. In a little more than a moon, Jasperus continued, we should reach a mountain pass just east of Mount Viscano, Vendaris's only active volcano. It's in the Mindrin Mountains, but that will be our halfway point to Mavis's fortress, which is built into the cliffs of Mindrin on the northeastern shore. Do you think she knows we're coming? Eliana asked. Or do you think she expects you to hide me? I think she prepares for both, Veldin shrugged. Realistically, she probably assumes we're bringing you so we can protect you while we come. Which just means we have to come up with some amazing way to surprise her and catch her off guard. Can't pneumatic progenies see the future? Cyrus asked. Isn't that where she lands on the wheel of magic? Think of it more like sifting through someone's desires and plans, Veldon said. It produces possibilities, but nothing certain. Besides, Mavis's strength is similar to mine. She sees more of what's happening in the present. She tends to sift through evil intentions of a person, whereas I tend to sift through the truth of a moment, like when I sifted Vera's soul using her cloak. Their conversation with Veldon was cut off by Silmar, who saw their confusion as an excuse to run through the Wheel of Magic properties again and again until Eliana could recite them and scratch the image from memory into one of the giant tarot leaves. Just when Eliana thought Silmar might let them stop for the night, sharp pain dug between her shoulder blades. She stumbled, pulling at her pack and quiver in an effort to get them off. Eliana? Cyrus took her pack, then helped her to the ground, where she kneeled, forehead against the soil. What's wrong? I didn't think it would happen, she said. Not after we healed it. Lukai fought his way through the line. What's happening? Is she hurt? Eliana squinted up at him, then took in Silmar over Lukai's shoulder. I think she's sending another message. Her hands trembled, but she undid her top button, then swept her hair to the side and bent forward. Warm fingers brushed her neck, and the fabric was pushed aside. Several gasps rang out. I've never seen magic like that, Iris whispered. It has to be blood magic. Disgust tinged Kendallen's tone. I've seen it before, Silmar said quietly, but I'm not even sure I'd call it magic. What does it say? Eliana couldn't keep the desperation out of her voice. For a moment, no one seemed willing to tell her. Then Cyrus placed a hand on her shoulder and kneeled beside her. It says she belongs to me.
I hope you enjoyed listening to the latest installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. If you enjoy listening to this narration, you might also enjoy listening to Paeter's podcast, Christian Geek Central, where he discusses movies, video games, and all things enjoyed by self-proclaimed geeks from a Christian worldview. Thanks so much for listening.